Welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And in each episode, we explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast changing markets.
You'll hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are applying these mindsets to thrive in this uncertain environment.
So, subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and check out our companion blogs at insurgentsgroup.com for a summary of takeaways from each episode. Now, let's get into today's conversation, Matt.
Good to see you, Rondo. I think we're going to
Likewise.
explore a topic that's been on our minds for a while and really gives us an opportunity, particularly at least in Australia at this part of the season, to explore management and board offsites. Virtually every company on the planet runs these, and thought it would be interesting to share some perspectives on how to bring the insurgent mindset to this particular venue or opportunity for our listeners.
Yeah, sounds like a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Rondo, we probably do between, I don't know, 50 to 75 of these every year. And typically that'll be with an executive team or with the board, more often than not, occasionally with management teams. But, when you think about running an offsite with a client or advising a client on an offsite, what are some of the framing questions that you might start asking that client to kind of get a sense of what they're trying to accomplish and what that offsite seeks to achieve?
So I think big picture, I want to start by understanding from the board chair or the CEO, whoever is the person sort of sponsoring the event, to understand what does success look like from this actual board or leadership meeting. Does it mean that you have a cohesive or the framework for a cohesive strategy? Does it mean that you have provided more thinking on some of the big problems that's facing the organization? Or is it just a strategic plan, an annual plan that gives you a set of objectives, measures, and initiatives? And I think the more interesting answer is there's a big problem that we need to wrestle as a team to set our organization up for what I would consider the medium term, the 3 to 5 year horizon. What are the big challenge? Understand as a group, what are the big challenges that we're facing, and then how do we win in that kind of environment, given the challenges that we have to be able to address. I think that to me would be one of the starting points. The other question is, who are all the critical people that need to be a part of the conversation? And what I would be looking for also is what additional information for folks maybe who are not in the room, whether it's other stakeholders who are not there, customer perspectives that would be available that would enrich the conversation and would drive a better outcome for the team. So those would be some of the things that I would want to start with.
Okay, so if I can boil that down to a couple of simple ideas, right? So, idea one is what's the problem statement for the workshop or the session that you're running? So, and I'd like to explore that a little bit because I think there are lots of different problem statements that really require quite different thinking about how to frame these workshops
Mm.
and or whether or not workshop is the right way to go about this as well. I also think it's interesting your point about the who. What's the optimal group of people to come together to weigh in on this particular topic? And I think that, unpacking that's going to be interesting too, because there's almost a default. Like if it's a board workshop, it's generally the board. If it's the senior leadership team, it's generally the
The
C-suite,
leadership.
right? And consequently, I think a lot of teams end up missing out on opportunities to bring additional perspectives into the flow of these discussions because of that sort of default assumption that a board workshop is the board and a ELT or a senior leadership team or C-suite workshop is the C-suite, right? So
Hmm.
consequently, you find that I think that can be quite limiting. We'll come back to that. So let's start with the problem statements. So another thing that you said that I think is really interesting is kind of the branching of are we are we here to solve an important problem? And that important problem might be, how do we deal with just picking up a topical issue? How do we deal with global energy disruption? That might be something that, you're going to zoom back and have a look at that. It might be something like how do we deal with an emergent competitor that's come onto the scene? It might be something like, how do we address significant internal challenges of productivity or value creation? There's a number of different things, but I think it's quite correct that it is important to have a framing theme. What is it we're trying to solve for here? In my experience, the many, if not all, offsites are built around a notion of this is just something we have to do every year. And the theme follows the idea that, it's time to do our annual offsite, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
I think it's in many cases the wrong way about. But so those are some external themes, and different firms will have different perspectives on what those mean and given their maturity and leadership styles and things like that. But I think there's also internal ones. Many times we'll work with firms that have let's say a new CEO comes on board, and that new CEO wants to sort of communicate a new vision or a new strategy to the leadership team, and then bring that out to the organization. So that happens quite often, and those types of sessions are very dependent on what does that leader need, what is their style, what's the dynamic amongst the leadership team, what are some of the internal challenges. Then there's another sort of internal, um, let's call it area of focus, which we see a lot, which is about creating alignment. So
Right.
where all the strategy work has been done, but now the challenge is to how do we communicate that strategy and how do we, get the organization behind that and make sure that everyone's connected to it. So that's quite often almost a default, right, for
Right.
for many organizations. And then to your very good point, I think is the planning, and I would say that most quote unquote strategy offsites are more oriented toward planning, which is a frustration for me, which is largely uh, we we performed in this way the last couple of years, and we want more of the same going forward. And those types of workshops tend to be very incremental in nature, where
Yeah.
you're making minor adjustments, and the assumption is that strategy isn't changing, which then brings the assumption that, oh, the market might not be changing, or internal factors might be stable as well. So I think that, first, to your point, like what is the problem statement? What are we solving for? We can have any number of different sort of configurations or frameworks that we would apply for a given workshop. Is it one day? Is it 2 days? What sort of people do we need around the table? What are some of the, is it more oriented towards team building and leadership development, or is it more orientated towards strategy or oriented towards planning? These are all very different. Um, these are all very different types of workshops, and they require, quite different thinking and quite different kind of methodology and approach to get to the nub, to get to success as you've described it. I don't
Yeah.
think there's a one size fits all approach to a given problem statement.
And I think that also to your point around alignment, I think that typically teams will go into these kinds of meetings with alignment and execution as the objective, right? So how do we come up with this plan that then becomes the governance structure for execution? Because, we know that a lot of organizations fall down when it comes to execution. So I think that becomes a big goal or objective of this kind of a session, and which is also why making sure that you're bringing in the right perspectives into the conversation, whether those perspectives are actually in the room or brought in by a facilitator or someone else on the team. You need to make sure that you have a very broad perspective to understand what might be some of those challenges coming out through execution. I also wanted to make a point of I think that more so than not, organizations tend to focus on this kind of exercise as a resource planning exercise, resource allocation exercise, excuse me. And so it's how do we divvy out our scarce resource? And most of the time, it's the allocation looks pretty consistent year after year after year, which then begs the question of really what's the change? What's changing?
Hmm.
In your organization. So I think that that's another tension that I believe that organizations that are more insurgent mindset oriented are being bolder. They're thinking about where are we allocating resources to drive the strategy that we've defined and address the problems that we've identified in our conversation, as opposed to allocating the resources to the various functions in the organization.
I think it's almost always going to be in addition to, but I agree with your point is, I guess it boils down to incrementalism, which is more of the same, how do we tweak the allocation of those resources? Um,
Hmm.
and or because there are always going to be some element of more of the same, right? That's not going to disappear. But and or to what degree is there a new set of opportunities or problems to be exploited, right? So from that point of view, I generally feel like in category B, sorry, category A, where we have a relatively incremental approach, 1 or 2 day workshop to sort of fine tune and adjust the allocation of those resources to a certain set of priorities, and then to your point, land on a roadmap to achieve that is probably the default of 80% of all the workshops in the world, right? So
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
generally what we're doing. And I would say that virtually every workshop will have a back end, which is some sort of converging on a set of priorities that then, whether that's in the workshop or in the outworkings following the workshop, there'll be some, laying down of to your earlier point of initiatives and metrics that will manage the governance of the output of that particular workshop. But I think that if you're in a situation where there's more volatility and uncertainty, and you need to use this workshop or it could be a series of workshops to
Hmm.
to be more divergent in terms of your thinking, right? So more creative, if you will, in terms of what are the options that are available. And let's be honest, we live in a world that is very volatile, right? So there's a lot of change, everything from AI to energy prices to labor shortages and on and on and on. There is a lot of volatility. So, I think it's harder to get away with being super incremental in your thinking. So, there is a need to have a more, kind of almost a more design thinking approach to your workshops where, you know, you have a, you have a deep exploration on the issues that sort of drive your particular problem statement. Like I said, energy prices, AI, whatever that might be, that
Yeah.
really speaks to often a level of pre-work for these workshops, which is quite significant, where coming into these workshops, you have the ability to present kind of concrete options to a leadership team, which then can get into a very into the depth of those issues where the team has largely in the early part of the workshop a more unconstrained view on what those options might look like. And then as you progress the discussion, you find that then gets more and more constrained and converges on a set of priorities for the business. And I think that it's like anything else. The amount of preparation that you put into to work through those challenges ahead of time plays a big role in the quality of the output in these workshops. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that in 1 or 2 days you're going to conjure up a new strategy, whether it's facilitated or not, which is going to take the company in a different direction or is going to be rigorous enough to be able to really address at a deep level the challenges faced by, many organizations.
And I think that getting teams, leadership teams aligned on what are those external issues and understanding different perspectives that across the team around those issues is such an important part of this kind of process. And sometimes I think it gets short end of the stick because there's so much, I think there's a lot more energy to just sort of get to the part where you define the plan as opposed to stepping back and doing the thinking. And I think that that's where the organizations that excel are willing to make that investment to do the thinking. And I think that that's what we bring to the table that's a little different is pushing that level of thinking across the group.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, that thinking requires being able to apply different lenses to the problem or opportunity faced by the business, right? So, uh, it's unusual, I would say, to get fresh thinking from a group of the same people that's been stable for a really long time. So,
Hmm.
I think a couple of my frustrations in looking at how many organizations approach these things. So, first, um, a general laziness on exploration of externalities and trends affecting their business, right?
Yeah.
So, the typical approach might be to apply SWOT or PESTLE to the process of thinking through these things, which is almost always insufficient, almost always lacks, depth and flavor in terms of understanding, how these different trends layer together to create opportunity for a particular firm. So I think most businesses are quite poor at that or pay lip service to it, or even worse, um, decentralize that down to, sort of junior people. They'll come up, you give somebody a SWOT template, they're going to come up with lots of stuff that's going to be on there. But I've rarely seen one that's particularly insightful. So I think that's one area. I think, again, in this volatile environment, like at least here in Australia, in most businesses that we look at, um, some of the techniques and tools that are available to them aren't used in these environments. So we've talked before about scenario planning or game theory. How do we really rigorously understand how these choices will unfold in different futures, for example, and what the
Yeah.
common ground is for us, and how we can use that common ground to, forge a strategy going forward. I find that those techniques aren't widely in use here, and I think that's a miss. And there's many others that aren't in use. I think generally my feeling, as I agree completely with you, is that if you want fresh thinking, you have to approach the problem in a different way 9 times out of 10. And if you have a very extrapolative kind of do more of what we're already doing, but allocate the resources more efficiently, that's only going to be part of the story, I think. I think in this environment, you have to kind of transcend that and get beyond that. So
What
that's,
do,
yep. I just want to
No, I
make
was going to
one
ask you,
more
what are
point.
some of the techniques that you found that worked well with your clients to get them to um, think about what are some of the assumptions that they're operating in and help them sort of think about those assumptions in the context of the emerging environment and what might need to change?
Right. And I think this is where you start to see the joining of innovation and strategy. And I think a lot of the innovation techniques are really helpful to help leadership think differently about strategy. So you mentioned assumptions. I'm a big fan of deep thinking on assumptions that drive how a business looks at demand side priorities or challenges. So things out in the market, assumptions about competition, customers, about suppliers, about market forces, about trends. I think over a period of time, businesses develop and almost these ossified assumptions, right? These assumptions that have
Right.
been true for a long time, and then all of a sudden they're not true, and then the next thing you know, you're sort of going over a cliff. I really like kind of deep thinking around embedded assumptions in a firm. And I think often because that doesn't come up, these assumptions, kind of carry forward and perpetuate. And then consequently, we don't see when they no longer hold water. So one technique on that we use, we call it flip, which is basically first surface the assumption and then flip that assumption upside down or turn it 180 degrees and think about what if this assumption wasn't true, or what if this assumption was completely different, right? So if we have a particular assumption about we're competing with firms X, Y, and Z, what if we're competing with firms A, B, and C? That might be completely different in terms of how we reflect our value proposition into the market, for example. So that's one thing I think is really important, really interesting. I was going to make a point earlier. Another technique, and this is simple, and I think everyone can do this, but virtually no one does it, is to your earlier point about who's around the table. It's interesting that so many of these workshops are built like these little mini castles or fortresses where you have the same leadership team every year talking about the same kinds of things every year. I really
Right.
think that's a huge opportunity to open that up to bring, for example, customers into that process. Virtually every workshop, or at least almost every workshop with clients that we work with on this end, Rondo, we're always suggesting that bringing that outside in perspective is really important. Why not bring your customers into your strategy design process? Why not bring your key suppliers into that process? And it's difficult to bring your competitors in, but you can do research to bring that perspective into the discussion, right? So I think that's really important, is to open up the mindset of the leadership team, because if you're just the same people breathing the same air, you're going to come up with the same ideas and concepts
Right.
that by definition is going to limit the optionality available to your business. So I think that's really important. And there's a bit of a science to how you do that, and what is the role of customers, and being willing to hear the ugly as well as the good, I think is
Yeah.
important too, from a
I mean,
mindset.
because what that allows you to do is to widen the lens, right? Because right now the team is coming in with a very narrow perspective based on what they know, but with by bringing in this other information from other stakeholders, you sort of widen the aperture a bit, and now you have a different perspective. You sort of tap into some of the blind spots that you might have that you can't see because you're so focused on your own perspective. Another thing I find is that there's this because we operate, most of what we do is done automatically. We don't think, right? So it's harder for people to sort of question their assumptions because most of their decisions and things that they do is pretty automatic because they're routine. This is an opportunity to sort of step back and slow things down and really start to question the way you do things, how you're moving in the market, your value proposition and why that might still work or not. And it's like it's an opportunity to sort of pause and slow down and have that sort of more deliberate conversation around what the future really looks like and how do you get there.
I agree with that. And I think you can almost have a two-speed workshop where some of the routine is quite routine, right? But
Yeah.
coming back to my earlier point about themes, or, key issues and challenges, I think you can always carve out time to work one or more of those big opportunities or challenges faced by the organization, just to build that muscle to widen the lens, as you talked about a moment ago. I think that's really key. You asked me before about techniques. The other thing I think is really helpful is to apply analogs, which is a key innovation technique, and I find it really useful. Is how do you think laterally about the challenge that your firm faces in the market? Well, you need to. It's not as helpful to look down the street at what your clone competitors doing. It's much more interesting to look at how other firms in other parts of the economy are expressing their value propositions differently, or applying alternative business models to novel business problems and challenges, and how those insights might apply back to your business. So I think that discipline of creating a deliberate and intentional way to, using your language again, is just widen that lens, is almost always pays off, because when you start layering uh, a different lens to the problem, maybe a scenario planning approach, maybe a different way of looking at trends and externalities in your environment, those things start to come together and provide new sources of insight. And then when you add to that, bringing different stakeholder perspectives into the discussion, customers, suppliers, or even junior people, customer service representatives who are out in the field, speaking to customers. Those are valuable sources of insights that often don't find their way around that sort of executive table, or at least don't find their way around in an unfiltered way. So I think that's another thing you really have to be open to. And if you're not, then you're going to default to kind of more of the same more often than
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. I think about some of my work with a couple of the boards that I've worked with, and I think the beauty of uh, an external board is that you have people who are operating in different industries. They're bringing an outside perspective into an organization where you're working with the management team that's there ensconced in the organization on a day to day. That's one of the ways I find that that's such a healthy way to bring that external perspective, in addition to the other perspectives that you talked about, clients and other suppliers, for example. But I find that that board perspective is so important, and that's why I think that the board and management team relationship and how the board contributes to the development of strategy in an organization is so important because they have that outside perspective. They can bring so many different nuances to the conversation that the folks inside the organization might miss, you know, things that they probably haven't thought about.
I agree with that. The challenge there is twofold. One is that the board often lacks the time to be able to get into the nuance, right, about the market,
Yes.
about the company, and that sort of part of its time, but also visibility to, kind of the information and data in the business to help them really surface those insights. So they rely on management to do that. So what that means is that um, the key skill set is how do you curate that for the board so that they can leverage that limited time in a really effective way to be able to weigh in a meaningful way to support management. And oftentimes it's very superficial, and those opportunities are missed out because the board hasn't been appropriately curated, or the information hasn't been curated for the board in a way that the board can actually add value to that conversation. But I completely
Hmm.
agree with you. Part of that curation is to put the board in a mindset of how do you leverage your other experience into this problem set within the organization? And that question doesn't get asked often enough. So I think, you know, unless somebody's actually managing that flow of information and discussion, uh, more often than not, a board paper will come. Here's the strategy. What do you think? And the board will
Right.
weigh in on that, but they won't be part of that divergent discussion. So they're only part of the convergent part of the discussion, which is it's already been served on a platter. And then it's a question of, which element, which of the canapes on the platter are you going to be eating, right? It's the board
Right.
doesn't necessarily have a lot of opportunity to think about, what's on the platter.
Yeah, that's why the board should be involved in that process before the strategy gets baked in, before management has made these concrete decisions that then become harder to, to change. The board needs to be involved on the front end.
Yeah, and a good way to think about that is like it's for private companies, it's the voice of the board or the shareholder. For public
Hmm.
companies, it's the voice of the shareholder that the board represents, right? And then you have the voice of the customer in the market. You have the voice of the internal team. You have the voice of the numbers, right? So there's a number of different perspectives that kind of come into the preparation for these things. And it all has to be designed quite deliberately so that you're sort of feathering this information together to a point where not only do you have enough territory to have that creative divergent discussion about these things, but you also have the rigor to be able to make decisions and then allocate those resources. So you have to do both. And
Yeah.
I think to our earlier point, most I think most management and strategy workshops are oriented much more towards that downstream rigor in terms of allocating the resources and are much weaker at the upstream part.
Yeah. And I also think the other challenge to making sure that you get that kind of thinking is being receptive to contrarian views in the conversation. To me, oftentimes there's a appetite to get to a quick consensus on a problem. And I think by being able to push boundaries and bring up contrarian viewpoints, I think only enriches the thinking on that problem and will probably lead that team into a better final decision as to where they end up. But I think oftentimes it's sort of like there's a interest in getting to a quick answer as opposed to sort of getting in the mud and really getting deep into the problem itself.
And I think that's a limitation of the kind of the mindset of we have to run these workshops every year and it's going to be 1 day or 2 days, right? And I think it's perfectly okay to have thrashed out key issues and not come to a conclusion just so long as you have a path forward to be able to run that to ground. And I think
Right.
that's all right. But often because of the time pressure, both in terms of the budgeting process and the annual cadence, um, the idea of getting to a result in that workshop is it becomes the product, right? So the
Right.
workshop is the goal becomes to run the workshop. The goal isn't necessarily to, or not necessarily always to get to that insight and get to that decision space. And I think back to my earlier point, oftentimes, it isn't the workshop. It's a process that you need to really go through to um, kind of get the insight that's required to make those decisions. And the workshop is part of that formula, but maybe not the alpha and the omega of the formula.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, how do you handle this? You know, you have an organization that had, let's say, went through a pretty transformational strategy development process. And now they're in year two of that transformational process, and they're coming back together as a team to plan the next year. How much of this approach would you say that this team has to adopt in that second year versus the first year? Is it more of like when you back in the day when we used to talk to organizations around strategy execution, it was like, okay, so now you're really doing a review of your review process and figuring out what's changed in the market, and you're adapting your strategy based on what changes you might see, but it's not a wholesale adjustment to it, probably. How do you, now that we're thinking about this through the insurgent lens, what's like one or two recommendations that we would give to a client year two of a transformational strategy and as they approach their planning meeting for that the next
Right.
year?
So I think that there's a lot there, Rondo. So the first thing on my mind is the amount of that change is proportional to the amount of uncertainty and volatility in the market, right? So if there's a lot changing, then that sort of incremental approach is potentially risky, right? So I think what we love is the safety of here's a 5 year, a 3 year transformation. Um, Here's a set of assumptions underpinning that. Here's an action plan to do that. Year one, we've done the hard work to develop that. Year two, it's just turning the handle and making sure we bed it down. But the reality is that there may be significant change that requires you to continually challenge the key assumptions underpinning that transformation and make sure those things are still true. So I think that there is rigor required to sort of have that deep thinking. And I think also one of the risks of a big transformation effort is that if those things do change and you do have to pivot and readjust, um, it's challenging and expensive. So there's a default to just stay the course. From an insurgent perspective, Rondo, I think that um, the idea of a fixed 3 or 5 year plan is, you know, only relevant when we're really confident that the environment and the market and the internal factors are really stable. And if they're not stable, then you need a much more dynamic process than that, even in a transformation sense, coming back to that and saying, okay, what's changed outside? What's changed inside? How do we reallocate our resources accordingly and pivot if necessary, change our business model if required, change our value proposition if required. These are all things that you should be doing, on a very deliberate cadence. I don't know what the
Yeah.
cadence is. It might be quarterly for one firm, it might be bi-yearly for another firm. But you have to be deliberate and intentional about it. But what I do know is that that cycle is shortening for most firms, and the amount of change coming makes it harder and harder to commit to long-term fixed 3 and 5 year strategies, and also long-term fixed 3 and 5 year transformation programs. So what I'm seeing more of is where the transformation is about creating more optionality for a business to pivot. So more like Lego bricks, where, the transformation provides, a lot of systems capability, which allows you to, adjust to the market, not necessarily create a fixed view. Like in the
Hmm.
old days where we had these big weighty, I don't want to say SAP, but ERP systems that are, quite rigid. Even those systems are much more modular and allow for, much more kind of adaptive approaches to the market. So I think from an insurgent point of view, I would almost always be trying to trade um, flex. I want to trade up my flexibility and I want to trade down the rigidity wherever possible. So as I'm thinking about that is how do I inbuild that to my transformation so that it allows me to pivot on labor, pivot on capital, pivot on
Yeah.
PPE, et cetera.
Yeah, my experience has been that most of that pivot happens at the initiatives level, like that resource allocation, where they're placing their bets will change, but the big picture doesn't change dramatically, so to speak. But it's more at the optionality is more in the portfolio of how they get there. That's what I found.
I'm not sure that's always true, right? So I think certainly how that optionality is expressed into investment is almost always on that end of the spectrum, right? But
Hmm.
um, I think the thing is what leaders need to understand, and particularly as they're developing these workshops, to circle back to the topic, is that sort of building in that flexibility, adaptiveness to the market, the ability to pivot um, at the front end is important, right? So, and in order to do that, it's about having an opportunity scanning a market opportunity scanning mindset where um, in this world, for example, with AI, we're seeing a lot of firms putting a lot of energy into applying AI to cost savings, right? But not necessarily how do I use AI to change my business model, or how do I use AI to create new sources of value, or how do I use AI to disrupt a particular market? I think those opportunities are available to every firm, and this stuff is moving so quickly. If you're not having that conversation and you're stuck in a loop of um, a fixed a fixed 3 year strategy or a fixed 3 year transformation roadmap, which
Hmm.
doesn't open up that sort of space for the firm to be able to capitalize on emerging opportunity, you're missing something really important.
Hmm. But doesn't that partly speak to what is the North Star for this process, right? Is it about just cost cutting or cost savings versus productivity and value creation? And we've talked about that a couple times on our podcast. I mean, so part of this is setting up that workshop with the right frame so that you know where the conversation needs to go, right?
And that's the problem statement, right? So, what are we trying to accomplish here? What does success look like you mentioned at the beginning? And being really clear about that. So, if your problem statement is narrow, your outcomes will be narrow. If your problem statement is too broad, your outcomes will be wishy-washy, right? So, dialing that in and being really clear um, about that, and then being able to provide oxygen in these sessions to explore, right? So, where are the new emerging opportunities to challenge? Are our assumptions correct? Are they still correct? Are they still holding water? What's different? What's changed? And then how do we address that? And then where can we extrapolate where things are, working well and we're relatively stable? Let's do more of that, but let's be more efficient at it to drive more productivity outcomes. It's kind of like those three speeds, and you have to figure out what's the right mix and balance of your time expended upstream from your workshops in the workshops and downstream in the outworkings to make sure that you're sort of, kind of taking advantage of those things. It's relatively rare for it to be only one of those things, but trying to
Hmm.
find and create space to be able to explore those three sort of tracks is really quite important.
Yeah. And but also it also
In
means that
strategy, in starting one point, in strategy,
yeah, yeah,
if your workshop is more focused on leadership development, then that's something completely
it's
different
different.
again, right? So
So the only other thing I was going to offer is that it also means that the leadership coming into these conversations, whether it's the management team or the board, has to come in with an expectation that there's a bit of messiness in the beginning, right? You can't expect, in order to get to a good place, you need that ambiguity, you need that broad thinking, that exploration going on, and that can be messy and uncomfortable to people
I,
because they want to get to the answer right away. So it's being comfortable with having that messiness, sort of like building a house, right? It looks very ugly before you get to the foundation in there and the other pieces of it to make it really look finished. It's the same thing with this kind of a process as well.
I completely agree. So I guess in summary, right, the things that I would encourage leaders to think about is really work the problem statement hard, make sure that you're really clear on what it is you're trying to accomplish and why. Um, then two is to think very carefully about, you know, how can I widen my lens to bring additional perspective into the discussion, whether that be
Yeah.
a customer or junior people in the business or key suppliers, whatever that might look like. How do I widen that lens? I think that's really important. The third thing, as I just mentioned, is sort of carving out the space and the time to focus on the emergent, you know, the the big opportunities, the not quite blue sky necessarily, but a wider perspective, the divergent side of things, and then balance that with some of the more extrapolative kind of do more of the same but better kind of activity. Then understanding the role of kind of alignment and how do you bring everyone along, get them on the bus, and create that sort of shared view of what we're trying to accomplish and how to get there. And then obviously you want to land on a very strong plan that has a high probability of success and execution, but at the same time is flexible enough to be able to adjust and adapt. And I think that what I would say is, the output or the outcomes of a workshop are 100% correlated to how much work you do in advance and the rigor of that work and your ability to curate those perspectives that we talked about before in a meaningful way will almost always generate better outcomes. So I think those are blocking and tackling things, Rondo, but ultimately
Yeah.
to make these things work uh, isn't a trivial exercise and does require strong leadership, not just in terms of leading the organization, but leading the process of bringing these threads together to create positive outcomes.
And also one other thing to add on to your point about alignment and execution is so that's to that meeting and when getting that plan done, but the real rubber meets the road when you try to follow up on that. So what are you doing as what's your governance process to ensure, to your point, that as things change in the market, you get new information that you're really approaching this as a dynamic process and not as an annual event.
Agreed. Okay, Rondo, I think on that note, we need to wrap up, but great to see you. We'd encourage our listeners to come find us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, and we'll look forward to seeing you around the next time.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Take care,
Rondo.
Matt.